Benvenuti al CCAP Fest. Volevo presentarvi il nostro ospite di oggi, Gerd Gigerenzer, psicologo cognitivo, direttore emerito del Center for Adaptive Behavior and Cognition dell'Istituto Max Planck per lo sviluppo umano e direttore del Harding Center for Risk Literacy di Berlino. Il professor Gigerenzer ha dedicato la sua vita allo studio di come prendiamo decisioni, quindi come prendiamo decisioni razionali, è quindi l'ospite perfetto per il tema di quest'anno. Professor Gigerenzer, thank you for joining the CCAP Fest. Even if unfortunately we still need to meet virtually, we hope to have you in person in Padua for the future edition. You devoted your life to the study of rationality and decision making. The topic we choose this year is navigating uncertainty. With the doubt as a guide. CCAP is a member of the skeptical movement. We would like to foster rational decision-making in our society in the light of science evidence. But your studies demonstrate that we make inferences about the world we live in with limited time and knowledge. How our brain adapted to such an uncertain world?
Our brains evolved to deal with uncertainty, not with certainty. In decision sciences, there's a distinction between situations of risk, where one can calculate everything, and those of uncertainty, where the future is unpredictable, cannot be foreseen, there are surprises. And most of decision theory, economics, and other fields make interesting theories, but about a world of risk, about certainty, as opposed to uncertainty. And I'll try to understand how humans survive and cope with a world of uncertainty, where big data, where algorithms, complicated algorithms, are of little help. That's the challenge.
That's the challenge. So together, I was reading your books, and together with Daniel Goldstein, you first theorized the existence of the recognition heuristics. So a model of decision-making that assume that we decide on a criterion that is not directly accessible to our, let's say, consciousness, to the decision maker. Does this mean that our brain decides for us?
So it means that in situations of uncertainty, people cannot rely on just on logic, probability theory, although many of my dear colleagues believe so. But that means not taking uncertainty seriously and reducing it to situations of calculable risk. So in situations of uncertainty, people and also animals have evolved heuristics. A heuristic is a rule of thumb. And the recognition heuristic is a very interesting example because it uses one's ignorance to make smart inferences. So a very simple example would be if you haven't heard of something and have heard of something else. So a tennis player, you are not too interested in tennis, but a little bit, and there's a match. And you've heard about one player, not heard about the other one. The recognition heuristic tells you, bet on the one whose name you have heard. So interestingly, if you would know more about tennis, you couldn't use the heuristic because of course you've heard of both. Also, if you know too little, you couldn't use it either. You've heard of none. So it's a very interesting heuristic that exploits a fact in the world that often name recognition is correlated with performance. And then uses that to make a smart inference and exploit one's own ignorance. So that's an example of a heuristic.
Does this work only for person we know, or does it work for any kind of information we have to deal with?
It works in any situation where not knowing something, not having experienced something is informative. So animals use that in order to infer what food to eat and what to avoid. There are experiments with rats, for instance, that they are going with the food they recognize from smell. That's now a different, it's not name recognition, and avoid food that they do not recognize. And you can see the rationality behind that. But this is just one basic heuristic that you also can use in the stock market to invest. And the big question is, like every heuristic, where does it work and where does it not work? And we have shown that in situations where a heuristic works, that means where it's ecologically rational, so the world is set up in a way that, for instance, recognition is informative, that this simple heuristic can outperform the most sophisticated complex algorithms. So often less is more.
This is very challenges for us as science journalists, or as an association that wants to, let's say, foster the knowledge, the scientific knowledge within the society. So does this mean that sometimes it's a waste of time to explain very uncertain and complicated topics? Is it better to let the people live with their ignorance because they will use their experience to decide?
It is not, so less is more doesn't mean that not knowing anything is the best thing. As this simple heuristic explains, if you haven't heard of anything, you can use it. It's often like a certain amount of knowledge, and also using data is better than using everything. And that holds in an uncertain world. It does not hold in a world of certainty. In a world of certainty, then just use all the data that you can find. Do the most complicated calculations. And so, for instance, AI, artificial intelligence, works best in situations that are stable, where tomorrow is like yesterday, and the big successes are in games like chess and Go. The rules are eternal. You can't cheat on the rules, and they will hold tomorrow and yesterday. But the moment you want to predict what people do in the next years, whether a defendant will commit another crime, then the attempts to use highly complex algorithms fail. Simple heuristics that just look at 1, 2, 3 of these variables are as good as the complicated ones, and they're also transparent. You can understand them. And that's a big advantage, but also a big challenge, because many want to sell complicated stuff and impress other people.
In popular science, especially during the pandemic, the idea of heuristics and cognitive biases are very on fashion. At least in Italy, everybody writes and talks about them. You criticize the work of two of your colleagues, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, about their view on heuristics as a sort, I would say, of irrational and biased way to take decision making. And you said that rationality is not exactly the same as probabilistic calculus. What does it mean, this, in our everyday life?
Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have done excellent work making clear that people rely on heuristics. In my own work, I start from there and go beyond and ask the question, first, can we make precise models of heuristics So the recognition heuristic is a very precise model that you can put into the computer and simulate and test. And that is one progress. And the other one is to ask the question, in what situation do heuristics work and where not? In the Kahneman and Tversky research is mostly about situations of risk where you already know what's right. And you can see behavioral economics even loves to know what's right and show that you are wrong. In situations of uncertainty, that's not the case. Take the corona pandemic. At this point in time where we talk, nobody knows how it will develop. There can be some educated guesses, and if you want to predict that, you probably have to make short-term predictions, which are reliably. And in our own research and in that of others, very simple heuristics can predict better than big data analytics. So here is a preconception that turned out not correct in the Kahneman and Tversky work. And and under uncertainty, simple heuristics can be amazingly well. In the last book by Kahneman called Noise, he and his co-authors have now gotten these insights that simple rules can work well. So that's a progress, I think, that we were influential, and it has been more cautious about the term of bias. So the important point is, don't associate heuristics with biases. That's an error. You can equally associate complex models with bias. They're also wrong. So think about the financial crisis of 2008. These were complex mathematical finance models, and I couldn't predict that. So every model can be wrong. And don't have prejudices against heuristics. If you are in a situation of risk where everything is known, like if you play the roulette, where every possible outcome is known, there are consequences and the probabilities, you don't need heuristics. You don't need intuition. You need no psychology. You just calculate. But if you have to do with situation of uncertainty, like the flu, like humans, like understanding of language, which is ambiguous and uses irony and other things, don't rely on logic. You won't understand even what we're talking about.
You are very active in also developing models for science communication and risk communication. And this is very interesting for us as science journalists or people working in communicating science. We often discuss within the community of science communicators about risk communication. And we assume that communicating risk and communicating uncertainty is exactly the same thing. But listening to your studies, it's not exactly the same. Should we apply different rules in communicating?
Yeah. So if you communicate risk in the specific sense, that it means where we have reliable data and we can calculate things. That's one aspect. And even here, most people have never learned how to communicate them and can be easily misled. So, for instance, take a famous magazine in Germany once announced that shark attacks, they increased by 100% this year. Now assume you are somewhere in beautiful Italy on the beach. Will you let your children into the water? Will you yourself go on a surfboard if shark attacks increase by 100%? Can't be more. Huh? Now, the real data was that so there are every year about 10 people who die from sharks. It's the animal, one of the animals who kill least people. So the year before it was 6 worldwide death, and it decreased last year to 12. So that's 100% from 6 to 12. See, this is called a relative risk increase. The absolute risk increase is 6 in a year in the entire world. So that's just an example, and the same distinction between a relative increase and an absolute increase is not known to large proportions of our world, and it causes damages. A famous example is the contraceptive pill scare that happens every few years in the UK and other countries. The most well-known case was when the UK Committee on Safety of Medicines got a press conference, an emergency press conference, said that the contraceptive pill of the 3rd generation increases the risk of a thrombosis by 100%. Now, what do? Many British women and teenagers thought 100%, that's basically certain, and stopped taking the pill, which led to unwanted pregnancies and abortions. What did it mean? Again, it was a relative risk that frightens people. The absolute risk increase was, from the study, out of every 7,000 women who took the pill of the previous generation, 1 had a thrombosis, which increased to 2 in 7,000. So the absolute risk increase is from 1 to 2 in every 7,000, or communicated as a relative risk increase, it's 100% more. This simple communication caused in England and Wales about 13,000 more abortions than usual.
We experienced this in recent days with the AstraZeneca vaccine here in Italy.
Yeah.
It was stopped and then reintroduced because we had a single death of, unfortunately, of a young woman. But again, in absolute numbers, the risk is quite low, I would say.
Right, and also in Germany we had the same thing. Politicians stopped it for several days in order to probably to be overly cautious and to increase the trust into the vaccine, and which led to the totally opposite result. People didn't trust anymore. And this is a case of really bad decision-making, lacking psychological understanding what they're doing. And also, it illustrates that people are not used to weigh risks, rather to look at one. So there is this 1 to 2 or 3 deadly cases of severe thrombosis in 1 million people. It's an immensely small risk, but still some thought better no risk than a small risk. And they waited for months or 2 or 3 before they got what they thought is a safe vaccine or no vaccine, just wait, and didn't realize that in that time, the chance that you get infected and end up in the intensive care unit fighting for your life is much, much higher. And half of these people may die. So here is lack of risk literacy. And this is now about situation where you roughly can estimate the numbers. There's some uncertainty. But if you go into real uncertainty, things that are much more difficult to predict, what to do with the rest of your life, whom to trust, whom to marry, then this is also a part about of trying to learn how to live with uncertainty.
We always stack irrational decision-making in the lay people, but what about scientists? Are they victims of the same fallacies? I mean, is the knowledge of statistics or uncertainty an antidote toward irrational decision-making?
Yeah, I think the term irrational is used often discriminatory by people who always know better. You should be very cautious. In many situations, we really do not know what's the best thing. And the science is the best antidote against all these possible fears, mysticism, and forms of irrationality. And the scientific method should be taught in every school class. Be critical. And be critical towards just following what your peers think. Many of the so-called irrationalities, they have nothing to do with something that's misfired in the brain. They have to do with our social species. We are social beings. A human being would never achieve. We live from others, and therefore we often fall prey to the prejudices of others just to be accepted and not to be outcast. But we have to have the courage to think for ourselves. And if you lose friends, if you think for yourself, then you can be happy to get rid of them.
Certainly. And I would connect with what you just said about the fact that we should in some way understand that certainty doesn't exist. So, and that science is a good guide to take decision making, because at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the members of the Italian government, the Minister of Regional Affairs, Boccia, said, and I quote, to the scientists, "You should provide us certainties unless this is not science." And this was a quote that influenced a lot the public perception of what scientists could do in the pandemic. What should we do to dismantle the culture of certainty? So the idea that we should expect a certainty before taking a decision.
Yeah. So the first step towards risk literacy is to give up the illusion of certainty. That means, so Benjamin Franklin once said, in this life, nothing is certain except death and taxes. Okay? That's about it. All the rest is man-made. The rules of a chess game are certain in the sense we made them. But in the real world, people don't follow rules all the time. So then that's the most important step. Avoid all terms like certain. And also terms, we are not yet certain. It's nonsense. We're probably never certain. It's about the degree of certainty. And that leads you to weigh the risks. So people are sometimes amazed if someone who is vaccinated against a disease like COVID-19 nevertheless can get the disease. That happens. Nothing is perfect. But it's better than not getting vaccinated. So it's about weighing the risks. That's the second thing. And then one needs to understand a few basic concepts like relative risk and absolute risk. And don't be taken in by people who present you big numbers, relative risk increase, like 100%, which are absolutely tiny numbers. That's a very frequent technique in healthcare, reporting about healthcare. So people are impressed by 50% reduction. And really, it's from 2 in 10,000 to 1 in 10,000. Yeah, there's nothing big there. And the third step would be to understand how you yourself are functioning as the psychology of a social being who is so dependent on the approval of others. So the digital age shows it again, how easily people are both repeating or retweeting what others are saying, and also be shamed and harmed by others who have nothing better to do than to spread hate. So that's the first step towards risk literacy. And what you need is courage. Courage to inform yourself, so to read and to judge yourself, and then the courage to stand up for your values, even if others say, oh, no, you're wrong. And learn to argue.
Did your Institute on Health Literacy develop, models or programs to foster the risk literacy within the society or in schools? Do you have a good receipt to reach such a...
I invite you to go in the internet on the website of the Harding Center for Risk Literacy. And we have many tools to, for instance, fact boxes, which give you an idea about how good a vaccination is and what its downsides is. This type of information help you to prevent against kind of conspiracy theories or whatever nonsense. We give lots of information. We also train journalists. I have trained, God knows, more than 1,000 doctors in their continuing medical education, and my colleagues at the Harding Center, many, many thousands more. We also train people in the law, like judges, to understand what DNA evidence means, and also to understand how to be easily taken in if they not understand by numbers, which is a common game. So it's a kind of enlightenment institution that it gives you tools to understand things, but it also requires that you're mentally prepared to become an informed and mature citizen. And that's the basic. Just, it's the only time you live. Just try to understand the world and don't be afraid.
So actually, what we call the scientific citizenship requires some work also from the side of the citizens to be...
Right, yeah. To be, no, there is the Enlightenment, yeah? Allegedly some 100 years ago, yeah? We are not yet there. We have too many people who don't trust in science, who are not willing to learn the tools of science, the tools of thinking, of critical thinking, and first most, self-critical thinking. Don't believe everything you believe.
This is a very good suggestion. Don't trust too much in yourself in some way. I have a very last question for you. It's a personal one, but I just discovered that you are a jazz musician, and I found some videos of you on YouTube playing. So it came to my mind that jazz music is the less certain music. You have to follow what's happening within your group. Is there a reason why? Is there a connection, or is just something that came to my mind for you? Why you love so much jazz music?
No, music, particularly jazz, is strong in improvisation, and that's really uncertainty. You are on the stage. You know the general piece being played, but you're not playing according to the record, yeah? And you don't know exactly where your fingers are going. So it's high uncertainty, it's intuition. This is nothing like calculated risk. Yeah? You're taking risk, yes, but it's based on years of experience. That's called intuition. It's not in your consciousness. It's in your fingers, it's in your unconscious brain, and you just let it go. And it's very important to realize that not everything can be calculated. The music composed by algorithms is okay, yeah, but it's never a music that reaches a stage of a good musician who improvises or a great composer. So we need also here to, I personally admire the human mind and its capabilities. I don't see this as a bundle of biases, as many of my colleagues. It's amazing that humans can memorize an entire symphony, or playing by heart, doing improvisation. And all these things have to do with uncertainty. It's about dealing with it. You need a combination between intuition, and also the intuitions are based on some heuristics. So you always, if you improvise, you have some Lego pieces, some tools, but it's never something that you just write down and where there's the single right solution. No, it's uncertainty. And without uncertainty, we would have no joy in life. Just imagine that we would have an algorithm that could predict the future. So we would know what happens to us, whether our marriage would be divorced when we die, and the life would be as interesting as reading the newspaper of last year. We know everything. There's no reason for hope, no reason for being curious about anything. There's no disappointment. Emotions are no longer necessary. You don't have to trust anyone. You know already what's happening. Certainty would be the worst thing that could happen to us.
Thank you very much, Professor Gigerenzer. This was a fascinating travel in uncertainty. That's exactly what we want to bring to our visitors in the Chicap Fest. Thank you again for having spent some time with us, and we hope to meet you in person.
It would be a pleasure.
Thank you again.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Grazie mille, professor Gigerenzer, per questo viaggio affascinante nell'incertezza. Era esattamente quello che ci ha spinto a scegliere questo tema per questa edizione del Festival del CICAP. Cambiare la cattiva fama dell'incertezza e mostrare quanto in realtà è connaturata la nostra stessa natura umana. Speriamo di averla in persona a Padova nelle prossime edizioni. E per tutti gli altri continuiamo con il nostro festival. A presto!